towards the end of your presentation, you were suggesting that Keynes seemed to have won, and in terms of his whole idea about how the economy, how we could fix it in a sense. But it seems that the past 8 years seem to fit really well with what Mises and Hayek was talking about in terms of easy money and sort of rejecting the idea that just because we spend money or influence spending in a certain sector that will create prosperity, and it can't just sort of backfire. Maybe if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of the housing sector and how we supported it.
Well, look, I mean, Hayek and Schumpeter, actually, who both tried in the 20s, in Schumpeter's case, and in the 1930s, to construct a sort of a macroeconomic theory to challenge Fisher and Keynes. They were asking a different question, and I would say the wrong question, in the following sense. They were asking, how did we get here? And they posited that it was the nature, it was excesses in the boom that resulted in the crash. Now, Milton Friedman laid that one to rest, okay, by showing that there was no correlation between the size of the boom and the size of the bust. But that's the question that they were asking. And neither one of them, so the implication was that nature's cure would be the fastest one, okay? It's like when you go to your doctor and say, with a cold, and you want penicillin, the doctor will say, actually, I'm not giving you antibiotics, and also don't get any cold medicine because the best thing for you to do is just wait it out, okay? Now, they lost that debate, and they lost it rather definitively. So much so that Hayek stopped doing, he abandoned his attempt to create a theory of interest rate output and employment, as did Schumpeter abandoned his attempt earlier. Okay, and Hayek actually stopped doing economics. By 1945, he started doing what is really his legacy, and that is the development of the idea why centrally planned economies, or economies such as Britain's eventually became, and India's, with a very big government role supplanting management, why such economies could never deliver. And of course, he was proven spectacularly right. And it was also an incredibly sophisticated argument because it was based on information, and also not just the exchange of information, but who knew what, and certain kinds of, anyway. Because Hayek and Schumpeter, as I said, their advice was actually followed, okay, both by the Brits and certainly by the Americans, okay? And what happened is that the Depression got much worse. So that took, that was the natural experiment that I'm talking about. And on the other side, if you look, and I urge you always to do your own, look at the data, because that's, because it's very eye-opening. If you look at rank countries by when they abandoned gold in the Great Depression, which was, if you were, it's like the Greeks now. If you're on a, if you don't control your monetary policy, if your monetary policy is hitched to something like gold or the German central bank, and you're in a slump, you obviously can't. The only way you can stimulate your economy is, is if you break away. And if you rank countries by when they went off gold, and you'll see what that chart shows, which is, they recovered earlier. And of course, when FDR came in and the US went off gold in 1933, there was a big rebound that was stopped in its tracks, I think in 1937, when there was another big monetary contraction. Okay, and so the evidence that not only that he lost the argument, that they, didn't have he didn't have an answer to the question that Fisher and Keynes were asking is, if you're in this situation, is there anything that you can do that, that the government has actually the means to do, and that isn't destructive? Hayek never had the answer, and his support of Keynes during the war on on Keynes's sort of anti-inflation policy, and particularly his support, which outraged American conservatives when they brought Hayek over on his book tour for The Road to Serfdom, his refusal to to support the Republicans who wanted to kill Bretton Woods, I think shows that that Hayek admitted that that he he had not come up with an alternative to, but who did, of course, was Milton Friedman. And this is what's so odd about some of the discussion right now, because on Tuesday Harry Evans is organized a debate to launch a book called Keynes Hayek, organized an Oxford-style debate, which I don't know exactly what that is, between 4 Keynesians and 4 Hayekians, okay? And so he just emailed me and asked if I wanted to come, and I think it's just odd because, of course, the person who really, really mounted a successful challenge to Keynes's especially interpretation of the Great Depression, was Milton Friedman, because remember, Keynes said that in certain depressions, monetary policy doesn't work. And something else that you hear repeated time and again without reference actually to the qualifications that Keynes made. And of course, the Great Depression was his big example, because because then he went back to the drawing board and wrote the general theory, and advocated, that explained why monetary policy might not work. Well, Milton Friedman came along, and remember, Milton Friedman was he was not just a great theorist, but he was a great empirical economist. And he showed that, or he, made a very compelling case that it wasn't that it was ineffectual, it wasn't tried. That the response of the Federal Reserve was so weak and contradictory and at times perverse that they basically allowed the U.S. banking system to, bring the money supply down by 1/3, so obviously, starving the economy of credit, a sort of magnification of what happened here in 2008. Okay, so he said that monetary policy was effective, that Keynes had misinterpreted, and so he's the real, he did what neither Schumpeter or Hayek managed to do. So the question was, what are my thoughts about the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street? Well, I think that I guess what I feel is that it makes one a lot more it doesn't make one complacent or feel that we live in the best of all possible worlds, since we clearly don't. But it makes me a lot more confident that that we're going to that my children are going to have an excellent future, just like I had a much better life than my parents, and that that we do know what to do. It's politically always difficult to do anything. Okay, and you can see right now the agony in Europe over should Greece stay in or drop out, or should we bail them out? These are politically hard things, but the economics is not so hard, and the economics is, I think, pretty much more hopeful than either of these groups. Okay. In other words, the feeling, when I read that half of Americans think that the U.S. government is involved in conspiracies against, okay, or when I hear someone as smart as Bill Clinton agreeing with Lou Dobbs that the U.S. government has been making war on the American middle class for the last 30 years, when the last 30 years before this recession were some of the best times that any generation of Americans has ever lived through, of rapid growth in incomes, very shallow recessions. They were such good times that we became a little careless, or at least that's what that was Paul Krugman's diagnosis of why we got into the financial mess that we got into, because 30 years of good times makes you less inclined to take out insurance and take other prudential measures. So that's, I think that I always think that information and sort of a broad perspective is hopeful. And that is what Keynes, in the middle of, in 1931, when the world was really falling off a cliff, and that's when the Great Depression became great, and and over in the Soviet Union, by the way, there was no unemployment. Keynes, who was not exactly being listened to, said that he had no doubt that his grandchildren would have living standards 4 to 8 times as high as his. That, that the problem was mechanical, that there was a solution, that it didn't mean that, Western society had a terminal illness. And, that's what I hope people would take, that our problems aren't, we can deal with them. What 99% thing? What do you mean? Oh, the top 1%? Well, okay. This was not in the introduction, but I wrote those first stories that Bill Clinton waved around on the front page of the New York Times on the top 1%. Okay, so I started that little trend in journalism, And it was based on one of my great sources, Paul Krugman, showed me the data. And, but even then, and I didn't, obviously I just spent a couple of weeks, but even then, I knew that that trend didn't mean what people said it meant. Okay?
Frank Borman here. I asked you my most difficult question, but one that you are uniquely qualified to answer. Why has there been so little convergence of opinion among economists? Now, is it because of personality? You've immersed yourself into the thinking of these people, so you should have some insight on that.
Well, the insight that I have, and I really focused a lot on where they, when they changed their minds or when they agreed with people who they normally disagreed with. And what I found, first of all, Hayek supporting Bretton Woods was a very courageous thing to do when he was penniless and he had all these rich conservatives who were, ready to make him a poster boy. But it was also true that Keynes was, one of the great things about Keynes is that he could have, been screaming at someone or being screamed at by someone, and an hour later, if there was some common ground, he was talking again and allying and trying to convince. And that is, that kind of really civilized, vigorous, but civilized intellectual exchange is something that we as a culture could really learn something about. Because Keynes and I think it was also true of Fisher, they never stopped talking to people who disagreed with them. They didn't get mad when their advice wasn't taken. They came, they thought of a new way to present it. They went back to the drawing board and said, well, what did I miss? So that, we need more of that. And I think there is actually more of that. There's less disagreement because we're not listening to Robert Barrow and Larry Lindsay and Martin Feldstein talking to arguing with Paul Krugman and Larry Summer in an economics. We're listening to a bunch of people on cable TV who are ideologues, are it's like all or nothing kind of thinking. It's not aimed at solving anything. It's just aimed at making a lot of noise. So I believe that there are lots of very good economists, both conservative and liberal, who have a lot of constructive ideas. And I read about the conservative ones in the journal. And they're, Martin Feldstein has an idea about loan forgiveness, and Barrow has an idea about taxes. That are, people might disagree with them, but they're reasonable ideas that people on the other side could certainly, take seriously. So I think the answer is, I think there's much less disagreement than people say. And I just want to add that the first time I was on MSNBC, it was 4 guys, like at 8 in the morning. They were all talking. And the main thing they wanted to say, besides that economists have never thought, the reason we were so much trouble, because economists have never thought about the relationship between money and the real economy. Okay, like I didn't even have an answer for that. But the other thing that they wanted to say is that unlike physicists, economists don't agree on anything. So about 2 days later, there was this delicious article on the front page of the New York Times about an experiment that challenged Einstein's findings. You know, I mean, obviously there are always disagreements, but economics is really a tool. It's really an engine of analysis. It's a method. It's not a bunch of different ideological schools. It's not mainly that. That's not why people are drawn to it and think it's useful.
Well, I'm asking the same question that this guy asked, because you didn't give a satisfactory answer. We are now refighting, economists are refighting the 30s. And there is no agreement. Some of them are professors at Harvard. It's not just Chicago versus.
Right.
Now, you know, your subtitle talks about geniuses. Unfortunately, all these geniuses have left us with what is not a science, it's a laughingstock. You know, the cartoonists do.
You should have been on MSNBC.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. I think, you know, I'm beginning to think we need that Adam Smith and Ricardo gave us a wrong steer. We've got these people who are building minor mathematical models out of nothing. They sit in their offices instead of observation and so on. So I would suspect that although the economists you mentioned were geniuses, they weren't doing anything useful.
Well, I can, what? Okay. Well, you know, if that was true, I wonder why Google and Microsoft both have chief economists. I wonder why the economics profession, unlike my profession, and remember, I'm a failed economist, a dropout, is doing great. Why my graduate students who learn how to look at data, they're journalists, they all get jobs, okay? Even in this terrible, terrible job market of the last 3 years, all 10 of them every year have gotten actual jobs. Why? Because they use this engine of analysis just a little bit, and it's a big improvement. Look, I feel like when your web browser crashes, do you go back to index cards? You know, when your GPS steers you, you know, into a construction site, do you stamp on it? I mean, I think that, no, economics, you know, economists have not, we have not discovered, we've not done what Irving Fisher thought we could do, which is to tame the business cycle or prevent asset bubbles. But if you look at the countries that dispensed with the wisdom of economists such as it was, and like take Venezuela at the moment, which used to be up here and is rapidly you know, then if you look at it that way, like, are you better off or worse off using economics? I would argue that it's open and shut, and that you can see it in the performance of actual economies. Because we've had that experiment too.